No one at the outpost had ever gotten close to the feral dragon hatchlings. The creatures were small, about the size of a large dog, but their bright scales and sharp eyes made them seem bigger and more dangerous. Scientists from several planets had tried for years to study them, but every attempt failed. The hatchlings would hiss, flap their tiny wings and run in circles, making it impossible to approach them. Even the most experienced alien handlers gave up and called them untouchable. The outpost was on the edge of a wild planet. Red rocks stretched to the horizon, and the air smelled of metal and dust. The hatchlings' enclosure was in the center of the research area, a place filled with sensors, cameras, and barriers. Each day the scientists came with their tools, hoping to take notes or measure the dragon's growth. Each day the dragons ignored or attacked the machines. No one tried to touch them. No one wanted to get bitten or scratched even though they were small. Among all the scientists and guards, there was a human named Tom. He was a mechanic. His job was simple: fix broken machines, clean the sensors, and make sure the equipment worked. No one thought his work was important. He did not wear a research coat. He did not carry a scanner. He only carried a small toolkit and a lunchbox. The other species looked down at him, thinking he could never understand the dragons. Tom did not mind. He liked machines and quiet work. He liked watching the dragons from a distance, curious but careful. The hatchlings moved in a strange way. They were always together, but each had its own personality. One had golden scales that glittered in the sun. Another was dark blue with tiny silver spots. The smallest one had a red stripe across its back. When the scientists came too close, the dragons hissed and jumped, running to hide behind rocks or a metal wall. Some even climbed over each other to escape. No machine could reach them without being knocked over. One morning, Tom was walking to the enclosure with a broken sensor in his hands. The scientists were arguing nearby about whether to try a new approach. Tom did not hear them. He only saw the dragons sleeping in the sun. Their wings were folded and their eyes were closed. They looked calm, but he knew that calm could disappear in a second. Tom set down his toolkit and sat on a small rock near the fence. He took out his lunch, a simple meal of bread, fruit, and a small container of something warm. He did not make any noise. He just began to eat quietly. The smell of his food spread slowly in the dry air. The dragons stirred. The golden one opened its eyes first. It sniffed the air, twitching its nose. The blue one lifted its head, ears moving. The red-striped hatchling stretched and took a small step toward Tom. He did not move. He just ate, careful not to drop anything. The other scientists noticed too late. "Move back," one of them shouted. But it was too late. The hatchlings were already walking toward Tom. Not aggressively. Not in attack. They moved like they were curious, like they wanted to see where the smell was coming from. Tom smiled quietly. He had an idea. He slowly placed a small piece of bread on the ground, a safe distance from himself. One hatchling sniffed it, then picked it up carefully with its tiny claws. The others watched. Slowly they began to step closer, one by one. The scientists stared in disbelief. How is this possible?" one whispered. No one could explain it. They had tried everything. Machines, scanners, even food, but nothing worked. The dragons had ignored everyone. Yet here they were, calm and curious, approaching a human who had done nothing but sit quietly and eat his lunch. Tom finished his meal, leaving a small pile of fruit and bread. The hatchlings gathered around it, sniffing and tasting. They chirped softly, a sound no one had heard before. They did not hiss. They did not flap their wings in anger. They only moved slowly, carefully, enjoying the food. By the end of the morning, the dragons were close to the fence. The golden one even touched the metal with its nose, looking at Tom with bright eyes. He laughed softly. "See? You're not so untouchable after all," he said, though he knew they could not understand his words. The scientists had learned something important that day. It was not strength that made a species untouchable. It was fear, misunderstanding, and ignoring what was different. Tom had no power, no weapons, no authority. But he had patience, calm, and a simple human lunch. That was enough to change everything. As he packed up his tools and left, the hatchlings stayed near the fence. They watched him go, not with fear, not with aggression, but with curiosity. And in that moment, Tom understood something about humans. Sometimes humans did not need machines or force to achieve the impossible. Sometimes all it took was a small act of care, a quiet presence, and a meal shared from a hand willing to be calm. The outpost would never forget that morning. The untouchable hatchlings were still wild, still fierce in their own way. But for the first time, someone had touched their curiosity and maybe, just maybe, their trust. And Tom, the human mechanic no one thought mattered, had done it without trying to be a hero. Tom returned to the outpost early the next morning. The red rocks of the planet shone under the rising sun, and a soft wind carried the smell of dust and metal. The hatchlings were already awake, stretching their small wings and hopping around the enclosure. Tom watched quietly from a distance, carrying his toolbox. He had learned the hard way not to rush them or make sudden movements. The scientists were already gathered near the fence, talking in low voices. They were amazed at what had happened the day before. None of them understood how a simple human had calmed the hatchlings without machines, without fear, without authority. They whispered among themselves, some taking notes, others recording footage. They looked at Tom differently now, but still with surprise and a little doubt. Tom ignored them. His job was not research. His job was machines. Still, he could not help but feel proud that the dragons had responded to him. He moved carefully, opening the toolbox and checking the sensors near the enclosure. The machines were old and sometimes stopped working, and the outpost depended on them. While he worked, he kept one eye on the hatchlings. They watched him too, their small heads moving from side to side, sniffing the air. After a while, Tom sat down on a flat rock, tired from bending over wires and metal parts. He opened his lunch, the same simple meal as yesterday: bread, a little cheese, and some warm stew in a small container. The smell drifted into the air. Almost immediately, the golden hatchling lifted its head, twitching its nose. The blue one and the red-striped hatchling followed, each moving closer. The scientists gasped quietly. "They're coming again," one said. "It's impossible. They never do this with anyone else." Tom smiled quietly and set a piece of bread on the ground. The golden hatchling sniffed it carefully before picking it up with its tiny claws. The others watched, then slowly approached the food. They were cautious, moving step by step, their eyes bright and alert. The hatchlings were curious, not afraid. They were calm, something no one had ever seen before. The scientists began to ask questions, talking to each other quickly. "Is it the smell?" one asked. "Are they responding to humans differently? Has anyone tested this before?" They looked at Tom, but he shook his head. He did not know the answer. He only knew that the dragons liked his food and trusted him enough to come closer. Tom finished a piece of bread and gave the hatchlings some fruit. They chirped softly, a sound like tiny whistles, and sniffed everything he offered. None of the hatchlings hissed or jumped away. None of them tried to run. They stayed near him, moving slowly, learning that he was not a threat. While this happened, a group of scientists tried to approach the fence. They wanted to take measurements, to touch the dragons, to record their behavior more closely. The hatchlings turned their heads toward the humans and hissed softly. They flapped their tiny wings and moved back, staying out of reach. It was clear that they trusted Tom, but not the others. Tom did not interfere. He stayed calm, sitting on the rock and eating quietly. He knew that sudden movements would scare the dragons. He knew that rushing them or trying to show authority would ruin the trust he had earned. He felt proud that he understood something important. The dragons did not respond to force or technology. They responded to calm, patience, and simple care. The scientists watched, amazed. "He is just a mechanic," one whispered. "He does not have training, he does not have authority, but the dragons follow him." "Why?" Tom looked at the hatchlings and smiled. "I do not know," he said quietly. "Maybe they like the smell of food. Maybe they like that I am not rushing them. Maybe it is just who I am." He laughed softly. "Or maybe humans are good at things others do not see." The hatchlings moved closer, one of them brushing its tiny nose against the warm container of stew. Tom laughed softly and let them have a small taste. They ate carefully, looking up at him from time to time, their eyes bright and curious. They were still wild, still small dragons with sharp claws and bright scales, but for the first time, someone had earned their attention and trust. By the end of the morning, the hatchlings were near the fence, chirping and sniffing, but calm. Tom packed up his lunch and tools, ready to return to his work on the sensors. The dragons watched him leave, not with fear, not with aggression, but with curiosity. The scientists continued to take notes, recording everything they saw. They understood now that humans had a different way of connecting with the unknown. They had patience, curiosity, and small acts of care that could achieve what machines and technology could not. Tom walked back to the workshop, feeling tired but happy. He knew he was not a hero. He did not need to be. He had done something important in a quiet way. He had shown that humans, even a simple mechanic, could reach creatures others considered untouchable. He had shown that sometimes all it took was patience, calm, and a small meal. The hatchlings stayed near the fence long after Tom left. They were still wild, still feral, but they had learned something too. They had learned that humans were different, not dangerous, and maybe even trustworthy. And for the first time the outpost began to see humans not as weak, small, or unimportant, but as a species with skills others could not understand. The galaxy had ignored humans for a long time, but the feral dragon hatchlings were learning something new. Humans could reach the impossible in ways no one else could. Tom arrived at the outpost early again. The sky was a pale orange, and the red rocks glowed softly in the morning light. The hatchlings were awake, moving slowly around their enclosure. They chirped and sniffed the air, their wings folded neatly against their backs. Today Tom carried only his small toolbox and his lunch. He did not need anything else. The scientists were already at the fence, whispering to each other. They still could not believe what had happened. The dragons had never approached anyone before. Only Tom, a human mechanic, had earned their trust. They took careful notes, cameras pointing at the enclosure, hoping to record another miracle. Tom opened his lunch, a simple meal of bread, fruit, and a warm stew in a small container. The smell drifted into the dry air. The hatchlings froze for a moment, then their heads lifted. Their noses twitched. One by one they began to move closer, their small claws crunching on the dry ground. The golden hatchling came first. It stepped carefully toward Tom, sniffing the air around him. The blue one followed, moving a few steps behind. The red-striped hatchling moved last, staying alert but curious. None of them hissed or flapped their wings. None of them ran. They were drawn to the smell of the food, but they were careful. Tom smiled quietly. He slowly placed a small piece of bread on the ground in front of him. The golden hatchling sniffed it, then picked it up with its tiny claws. It tasted the bread carefully, its eyes wide. The blue and red-striped hatchlings watched closely, then stepped forward. They too took pieces of bread, eating slowly, testing the food. The scientists whispered among themselves, amazed. "It's the smell," one said. "They respond to the smell of the food. No one else can get close to them, but humans, just humans, can." Tom nodded quietly. "It is not just the smell," he said softly. "It is patience. It is calm. They know I will not hurt them. I'm not rushing them. I'm not afraid. That is why they trust me." The hatchlings circled him slowly, sniffing everything. They touched the ground, the rock he sat on, and even the small container of stew. They chirped softly, a sound like tiny whistles, something the scientists had never heard before. They were curious, not afraid, not aggressive. One hatchling, the golden one, stepped closer than the others. It sniffed Tom's hand. He held it still, letting the hatchling touch him. Its tiny claws were soft and it did not scratch him. It looked at him with bright eyes, then returned to the bread on the ground. Tom laughed softly. "See? You do not need to be afraid," he said quietly. The hatchlings did not understand the words, but they understood the tone. They moved calmly, exploring, testing, learning. The scientists tried to get closer. They wanted to touch the dragons, to study them more closely. The hatchlings hissed and moved away from them. The golden one even flapped its tiny wings and backed up. It was clear that the dragons trusted only Tom. No one else. Tom continued to eat, finishing a piece of bread and leaving a few crumbs for the hatchlings. They ate carefully, their small movements precise and careful. They were still wild, still feral, but for the first time, someone had reached them without fear or machines. One of the scientists asked quietly, "Why humans? Why not any other species? We have stronger sensors, more experience, more authority. Why do they respond to him?" Tom looked at the hatchlings and smiled. "I do not know," he said softly. "Maybe it is our calm. Maybe it is our patience. Maybe it is that we share simple things like food without trying to control them. They understand that even if no one else does." The hatchlings moved closer to Tom, circling him, sniffing, tasting, watching. Their tiny claws did not touch him roughly. Their wings stayed folded. Their eyes were wide and bright. They were learning to trust him, not as a master, not as a researcher, not as a threat, but as a presence that brought safety and care. By the end of the morning, the hatchlings were close to Tom, enjoying the food he offered. They chirped softly, moving in small circles, curious but calm. The scientists continued to watch, taking notes, recording every movement, trying to understand what they had seen. Tom packed his lunch and toolbox slowly, letting the hatchlings finish their small meal. He stood up, brushing dust from his hands. The golden hatchling stepped forward and sniffed his boot, then stepped back. The blue and red-striped hatchlings watched, then followed him with their eyes as he walked to the workshop. The scientists whispered among themselves, amazed. Humans had a skill they did not understand. Humans could reach creatures others could not. Humans could calm the untouchable, connect with the wild, and achieve what machines and force could not. Tom returned to his work quietly, checking sensors and repairing broken wires. The hatchlings stayed near the fence, watching him from a safe distance. They were still wild, still feral, but they had learned something new. They had learned that humans could be trusted, that humans could bring calm and care, and that sometimes the simplest actions, sitting quietly and sharing a meal, could achieve what years of study could not. That morning the outpost learned a lesson it would never forget. Humans did not need machines or authority to achieve the impossible. Sometimes patience, calm, and a small act of kindness were enough to change the world. And for the hatchlings, the smell of a human lunch had changed everything. The outpost was buzzing with excitement. The scientists could not stop talking about what had happened. For years they had studied the feral dragon hatchlings. They had tried everything, machines, scanners, cages, even different foods, but nothing worked. No species could get close to the dragons. No one could calm them. No one could touch them. But then came Tom, the human mechanic. He was small, quiet, and overlooked. He had no authority, no training, no special tools. Yet the dragons had trusted him. They had approached him, circled him, and even eaten the food he offered. The scientists could not understand it. Tom returned to the enclosure that morning, carrying his lunch as usual. The hatchlings were awake and moving slowly, their tiny wings folded neatly against their backs. They sniffed the air looking for him. When they saw him, their heads lifted and they moved closer. Not fast. Not aggressively. Just slowly, carefully, trusting him in a way they had never trusted anyone else. The scientists gathered around the fence, taking notes, whispering, and pointing at the dragons. It is not just the smell of food, one said. They respond differently to humans. Other species cannot reach them, but humans can. Tom smiled quietly, placing a piece of bread on the ground. The golden hatchling sniffed it carefully, then picked it up with tiny claws. The blue and red-striped hatchlings followed, moving slowly and carefully. They were curious, exploring, testing the food. They were calm, something no one had ever seen before. One scientist, an alien with long green arms and bright orange eyes, shook his head. We have tried everything. Our technology, our authority, our knowledge, but humans are different. Why do they succeed where we fail? Tom shrugged. I do not know, he said softly. Maybe it is our patience. Maybe it is our calm. Maybe it is that we share simple things like food without trying to control them. They understand that even if no one else does. The hatchlings circled him slowly, sniffing the air, tasting the food, chirping softly. They were still wild, still feral, but they had learned to trust him. They were learning that humans did not rush them, did not threaten them, did not scare them with machines or authority. They were learning that humans could bring care, attention, and patience. The scientists began to understand something important. They had always thought the galaxy measured skill by strength, technology, and authority. The strongest species, the most advanced machines, the strictest protocols, they believed these were what made a species successful. But humans were different. Humans did not always rely on strength or machines. Humans relied on curiosity, calm, and patience. Humans had qualities that the galaxy had ignored. Tom finished his lunch, leaving a few crumbs on the ground. The hatchlings tasted them carefully, chirping softly, testing every piece. The scientists watched in silence. They had never seen this level of trust. They had never seen wild creatures respond to a human in this way. One of the scientists spoke quietly. We have underestimated humans for too long. They do things we cannot understand. They achieve things we cannot achieve. They reach the impossible without knowing it. Tom packed his lunch and toolbox slowly, letting the hatchlings finish their meal. The golden hatchling stepped forward and sniffed his boot, then stepped back. The blue and red-striped hatchlings watched, following him with their eyes as he walked to the workshop. The outpost had learned a new lesson that day. The galaxy had always judged humans by their size, their strength, their lack of advanced machines compared to other species. But humans had something the galaxy could not measure. Humans had patience. Humans had calm. Humans had the ability to connect with the unknown without fear. Humans could reach creatures others could not by force, not by technology, but by being themselves. The scientists took notes quickly, trying to understand what they had seen. They recorded every movement, every chirp, every sniff. They realized that humans could do what others could not because they approached the world differently. Humans were not stronger. Humans were not faster. Humans were not more advanced. Humans were simply different, and that difference made them capable of the impossible. Tom returned to the workshop, checking sensors and repairing wires. The hatchlings stayed near the fence, watching him quietly. They were still feral, still untouchable to anyone else, but they had learned to trust one human. They had learned that humans could bring calm, care and patience into a world that often demanded force and control. That day the outpost began to see humans in a new light. They were not weak. They were not small. They were not unimportant. They were a species that could reach the impossible, not with machines or authority, but with patience, curiosity and simple acts of care. And for the feral dragon hatchlings, the galaxy had learned something new too. Humans were not like the others. Humans did not conquer through fear or power. Humans conquered by understanding, by waiting, and by sharing what they had, even if it was just a small meal. The golden hatchling chirped softly, looking at Tom with bright eyes. The blue and red-striped hatchlings followed, watching. They had learned to trust humans in a way no other species could. And the galaxy, for the first time, began to understand that humans were a species worth watching closely. Tom arrived at the outpost early as usual. The sun had just risen over the red rocks, painting the landscape in orange and gold. The feral dragon hatchlings were awake and moving slowly around their enclosure. They chirped softly, their tiny wings folded neatly against their backs. They were waiting. Not for food only but for him. The scientists were already gathered near the fence, cameras ready and notebooks in hand. They were amazed at what they were about to see again. For years they had tried everything. Machines, scanners, barriers, even carefully controlled food. Nothing had worked. No species could approach the hatchlings. But Tom, the human mechanic, had changed that. He had done what no one else could. Tom carried his small lunch and toolbox. He did not hurry. He did not need to. The hatchlings knew he would come. As he approached, the golden hatchling lifted its head and sniffed the air. The blue and red-striped hatchlings followed, moving slowly, their tiny claws crunching on the dry ground. They came closer, carefully but without fear. Tom sat on a flat rock near the fence. He opened his lunch, bread, fruit and a small container of warm stew. The smell drifted into the air, catching the attention of the hatchlings. They circled him slowly, sniffing, testing, exploring. They chirped softly, curious, calm and alert. The scientists whispered among themselves. "It is not just the food," one said. "It is him. They trust him, not anyone else." Another added, "He is just a human, and yet he has done what our best handlers could not." Tom smiled quietly and placed a piece of bread on the ground. The golden hatchling sniffed it carefully before picking it up with tiny claws. The blue and red-striped hatchlings watched, then stepped forward. They took pieces of the bread slowly, testing each bite. They were learning, observing, trusting. One scientist asked softly, "Why humans? Why can they succeed where we fail?" Tom looked at the hatchlings and shrugged. "I do not know," he said softly. "Maybe it is our patience. Maybe it is our calm. Maybe it is that we do not try to control them. We just sit, wait and share." The hatchlings moved closer. The golden one brushed its tiny nose against Tom's hand, then stepped back. The blue and red-striped hatchlings watched, circling, sniffing and testing. They were still wild, still feral, but for the first time, someone had reached them without fear, without authority and without machines. Tom finished a piece of bread and left a few crumbs on the ground. The hatchlings ate carefully, chirping softly, tasting everything. They were learning to trust him. They were learning that humans were different. They were learning that humans could bring calm and care, and that these qualities were more powerful than machines or weapons. The scientists recorded everything. They realized that humans had abilities the galaxy had overlooked. Humans could reach the impossible in ways no one else could. They could connect with the wild, the unknown, and the untouchable. Humans could do what others could not with strength, not with tools, not with authority, but with patience, curiosity, and kindness. Tom packed up his lunch and toolbox slowly. The hatchlings watched him. The golden one stepped forward, sniffed his boot, then stepped back. The blue and red-striped hatchlings followed. They did not chase him, did not hiss, did not flap their wings in anger. They simply watched, calm and curious. The scientists spoke quietly among themselves. "We have underestimated humans for too long," one said. "We have looked for strength and power, but we did not see patience and care. That is where humans succeed." Tom returned to the workshop to check the sensors. The hatchlings stayed near the fence, still watching him. They were still untouchable to anyone else, still wild and unpredictable, but they had learned to trust one human. They had learned that humans could bring calm and understanding, and that this could achieve what machines and force never could. By the end of the day, the outpost had learned something important. Humans were not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most technologically advanced. But humans were unique. Humans could reach the impossible. Humans could befriend the untouchable. Humans could achieve what the galaxy thought was impossible, simply by being themselves. The golden hatchling chirped softly, looking at Tom with bright eyes. The blue and red-striped hatchlings followed. They had learned to trust humans. They had learned that humans did not conquer with fear or force. Humans conquered by understanding, by waiting, and by sharing small, simple things. And for the first time the galaxy saw humans in a new way. Not as weak, small, or unimportant, but as a species that could do what no one else could. Humans could reach the untouchable. Humans could calm the wild. Humans could change the impossible into something ordinary, simply by sitting quietly, sharing a meal, and letting the universe come closer. Tom walked back to the workshop, tired but happy. The hatchlings watched him, chirping softly, their bright eyes following him. They were still feral, still untouchable to anyone else, but they had learned something new. They had learned that humans were different, capable, and remarkable in ways the galaxy had never expected. And the galaxy began to understand that humans were not just another species. Humans were the species that could befriend the impossible.